Our next case is Resort Properties versus Waterloo Township. Good morning. This is a 15-minute mini oral argument on the application. Both have 2 minutes of a free fire zone, which you may waive, and you have a time that you may reserve for rebuttal, but we ask that you keep track of that time yourself, and you may begin when you are ready.
I'm not familiar with this. I'm not one of the preferred customers around here, so. Is this
Well,
just
first of all, pull the mic closer to you so we can hear you.
Yeah. And
Like
then I
this?
think there's a button that
That
will,
better?
If you want to raise it, there's a button up there that'll raise the whole podium for you.
and we'll restart the clock until we get that figured out. Yeah,
Okay.
there you go.
All right.
Good. I think we're good.
Now speak up so we can hear you. I went to too many Rolling Stone concerts in my 20s.
Okay. All righty. Well, the court has presented a wonderful question here. Whether
And you
the-
are?
Oh, yes, good point. I lost my keys early this morning, but so I do remember my name. Okay. My name is, I may please the court, is J. Thomas Franco here on behalf of Resort Properties. I'm here with Mr. Dal Salisbury, who is Associate Counsel on this matter. Okay. The court has presented the question whether the tax tribunal erred in holding that 68% of the ownership interest in Resort Properties Cooperative had been transferred. The answer is yes, they had erred, because 52% of the shares were held and continue to be held by 3 original shareholders: Babbage 24%, Fournier 24%, Duffy 4%. Only the balance of 48% was transferred, and subsequent transfers by Babbage cannot increase the percent transferred. This response is based on plain meaning of 2 words. Those 2 words are percent and cumulative. The ordinary meaning of percent, among others that were proffered in briefs previously in this matter, the number, amount, or rate of something expressed as if it is part of a total, which is 100, a part or share of the whole. Resort Properties put forth this definition in its first brief in the Court of Appeals and was repeated in the application here and the supplementary brief here. There have been no challenges either by the township or in any amicus brief. Cumulative means increasing or growing by accumulating or successive additions, or formed as a result from accumulation or the addition of successive parts or elements. That definition has been before this court since the application and has not been challenged by the township or in any amicus brief.
So let me ask you a question. As I understand it, there are 3 parties that held the total of 52%, correct?
They continue to hold the 52% throughout.
If any one of those parties would have transferred to a 4th party 3%, would that allow for an uncapping?
That would have put them over.
That would be enough.
That uncapped it. That would have uncapped it. There's no dispute about that. Okay. All right. I think we're confined to the fact that the 52% never changed hands. I mean, yeah, right. If even the 4%er had dropped out, we wouldn't be here. Okay?
What do you make of the argument from your opposing counsel that in other places in the statute that they know how to say, and they have specifically said that these are not to be cumulative, and they didn't say that here, so that means therefore it must be cumulative. The default is cumulative, and the other places, they accepted that out, they didn't do it here.
I know to what you were referring, okay? That is the exception at the end of 6H, okay? And it says here, a transfer of stock in the corporation, oh no, wait a minute, excuse me. Ownership only with respect to the real property that is assessed to the transferor lessee stockholder. It's our position that only cumulative transfers count any place in the statute, all right? It is not how the township decides to count it that determines whether it's cumulative or not. Its cumulative nature determines whether it's cumulative or not. Does it increase the percentage? That's the important part. And it goes on to say, a cumulative conveyance of more than 50% of the corporation's stock does not constitute a transfer of ownership of the corporation's real property. Cumulative is the modifier of conveyance. So a cumulative conveyance will work elsewhere in the body of 6H, but not over here with good reason, because they are separately assessed. And it also sheds light on what they mean by cumulative. It means this interest over here being added to this interest over here. There is nothing in the statute to suggest that a repeated transfer of some that has already been transferred becomes cumulative just because the township would like it to be cumulative. It's got to be cumulative. It's got to increase the percentage. Has that answered the question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Council, let me see if you think this is descriptive. I think that you're asking us to, or you're saying that this looks at a snapshot in time. And so at time one, we look at who started out with the property, and then at time two, we look at what were the changes in the percentages and what happened from time one to time two. And that's sort of how the tax should be captured, or the question about whether it should be uncapped. Is that accurate?
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay, I'm trying to understand. So I think that the appellee would say that they're not looking at the time one, time two comparison. I think that they're saying that they're looking at transfers all throughout. So they're looking at the question of whenever something goes from one party to another, they're adding up those transfers. And so I think there are two different ways of looking at it. So why does the statute support?
Plain and simply say they're wrong, okay? Plain and simple. And let me give you an example. If their definition of cumulative holds, and I was going to get to this eventually, but since I think it may be responsive to your question, let's say that I have a fence in front of me, and I get up one day and I paint 20% of the fence. And each day, by the time I'm done with 5 days, I paint the coat on the same 20%. By the end of the 5 days, have I painted the whole fence?
So, okay, so you're looking at the start of the time one is no fence painted, time two is 20% of the fence painted, and so that's sort of how we're comparing this, right?
Yeah, their definition of cumulative is a revenue raiser, plain and simple, all right? It's not cumulative. It does not add to the percent transfer, okay? When you have 52% that didn't transfer, it's a binary choice. It's like yes or no.
Do we have to rely on a sort of last in, first out calculation? That's the calculation that would be preferred by your client. Do we have to rely on that? And if so, where does that come from?
That is flat out wrong, okay? IRS, that comes out of IRS guidance rather. In Internal Revenue Service is concerned about capital gains and cost basis. Cost basis has nothing to do with it here. In fact, the statute does not mention shares of stock at all. It measures percent of ownership interest. And you have partnerships, and you have limited liability companies that don't even have shares. So why should a corporation have another burden added that the other types of entities don't? All right? And that's the problem with that. I gave about 5 or 6 reasons why that IRS guidance is totally inappropriate. It's just, in order for Michigan to rely on federal guidance, which is what this is, it's only guidance at the federal level, there's supposed to be a threshold to that there's a federal counterpart, like federal FOIA, Michigan FOIA, federal civil rights, Michigan civil rights.
So the understanding, I think, that you're suggesting is the 20% is the same, right? It was transferred, there's no exceeding the 48% that was originally transferred. And so you're saying that 20% was part of that percent, and then that same 20% then went to the next person, right?
That's right, and I'm also saying the shares are an irrelevant consideration that derives from IRS guidance, and it is so far afield for a variety of reasons. I cited that there are 504 references to the Internal Revenue Code in the Michigan compiled laws. Well, I'm going to engage a little extrapolation of the principle that the state one excludes the other. Well, the state 504 excludes the 505th, okay? It's not there. When the Michigan legislature wants to refer to the Internal Revenue Code, they demonstrated that they know how to do it, and they haven't done it here. They've even done it within the Property Tax Act, okay? Mainly down in the exemptions, where it incorporates federal exemptions into a Michigan law. They haven't done it, all right? It is totally irrelevant. If it was any more irrelevant, it might go full circle, okay? The identity of the shares, it doesn't change the percent. The standard is the percent.
Counsel, how do you respond to the argument that sort of the way you want to calculate the transfers would make it very difficult for local assessors because they don't have the knowledge of the specific allocation of shares? So they're just like, they're just adding up all the transfers in the year. And I think it was Amicus, the Department of Treasury said that would make it very difficult for local assessors. It just can't work that way.
How so?
I'm asking you, like,
all they have to do is look at the 52% that didn't change. It doesn't matter what else they decide to conjure up. You've got a plain meaning percent, plain meaning cumulative. I think somebody read cumulative and went berserk, frankly, if you want my explanation, okay? Because I don't see any reason whatsoever, I don't see any language in the statute that permits them to just pile on,
Would it be so difficult would it be so difficult for a local assessor to send correspondence to the homeowner and say, we see there's been some transfers, tell us what this is about? Would that be so difficult for the assessor to do?
We started with the local assessor, okay? This has been, the percentage argument has been out there. What's happened, it's been deferred, okay? When we made the motion for reconsideration, what we did is we presented in tabular form because maybe we failed to communicate at the hearing. But we didn't fail to communicate. They came back with the Internal Revenue guidance, deferred the percentage argument. Well, now that the Internal Revenue guidance is irrelevant, what are we left with? We're left with the percentage argument with no response by the township, no response by the tribunal, no response at the Court of Appeals, and we're here over the percentage.
I think you're suggesting that
Excuse me?
the township, if it has information about a percentage of transfer, obviously it's not that difficult to look at. That information that's what they're basing the capping or uncapping on. You're looking at that percentage based on the percentage of the whole, and it can't exceed 100%. So that information, the whole, would always be something available to the assessor at all. Yes, you could say to each, 20%, 20%, 20% of the fence, or it's been 20% 5 times, but there's still only 100% of a fence.
That's right, there's only 100%. No matter how you split it, if 52% is in one category There can be no more than 48% in the other category.
You have a right to rebuttal. You're down to 1 minute and 12 seconds. I don't know if you want to save it or finish it up now.
I will anticipate and just make the point that if ambiguity is created here, then, and we're not willing to concede that, if there is ambiguity, we're supposed to avoid absurdity. In this case, there are a number of absurdities. Number one is that the three who held 52% now own 84%. All right? Number two is the example that the amicus does about John, who retains 80%, but sells the 20, and that's resold, and John, well, we all know John. John is the prima facie reasonable person. John is shocked and amazed by the fact that his property uncapped while he held 80%. They argued that that was okay. I think that's absurd. Okay? I'll try to get back to my desk with the remaining 9 seconds.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chief Justice, Your Honors, and may it please the Court. Ross Bauer, appearing on behalf of Respondent Appellee Waterloo Township. My law partner, Stephen Rhodes, is with me this morning at council table. The implications of this case are significant for property tax administration throughout Michigan. We're asking the court to deny petitioner appellant's application. There are 3 main reasons why this court should affirm the results from the lower courts in denying the application. The practical administration of property taxes at the local level, the plain language of the statute, and the reinforcement of that statutory language by the legislature's choice of wording elsewhere. Based on the practical reasons of administering property tax assessments, the plain language and the reinforcement of that language elsewhere in the General Property Tax Act, we are asking the court to conclude that cumulative transfers count. And consistent with the Court of Appeals and consistent with the Tax Tribunal and consistent with the Bright Line Rule, that when determining whether more than 50% of the corporation has been transferred, all conveyances of ownership interests must be counted cumulatively, regardless of whether some interests were transferred multiple times or through intermediaries. I welcome the court's questions.
So I own a piece of property through a corporation. I sell 1% of the stock in this corporation to my brother, who passes it on to our sister, who passes it on to cousins, who passes it on to children. They pass this 1% on 51 times. You're going to uncap?
Yes, Your Honor. That's the, goes beyond the 80-20 hypothetical or the 90-10 hypothetical right to the 99-1 hypothetical, I believe is what you said, 1%.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
So where in the statute would that, what language says that's the right thing to do?
The language that we refer to in the statute is the emphasis on conveyances and not on the amount retained. If our position is the statute emphasizes and looks at the conveyances, and when the conveyances reach over that 50% threshold, that's when the uncapping occurs. And your hypothetical example, much like the one appellant has brought up, and in the amicus brief with the 80-20, but it's the same concept, where the majority or controlling interest shareholder doesn't change, yet the property uncaps. And I think that concept of that is the legislature's choice in how they have articulated the specific mechanisms for uncapping for this type of specific property based on their duties. So the Constitution limits the taxable value increases 5% rate of inflation, whichever is less, until a transfer of ownership. The legislature, through the GBTA, defines what that transfer of ownership is, or when that occurs. And there's other places where, for example, within the same statute, MCL 211-27A, there are other instances dealing with other types of properties, for example, transfers among corporations where they're commonly controlled. That's not an uncapping. But here, with this
What do we
type
do,
of
when you're talking about the conveyance, what are we supposed to do with the language after that that says of more than 50% of the corporation's stock? When I think of that, I think of the all 100%, and it has to be more than 50% of that 100%. But you're asking us to say that we can have this cumulative conveyance, and I'm having trouble seeing where that's at in the statute.
I think the cumulative conveyance, where we're seeing that obviously with the reference to non-cumulative shares elsewhere in the transfers elsewhere in the statute, meaning that cumulative shares must count in the rest of the statute or cumulative transfers. In this case, I think the stock or shares, the transfers, the conveyances that occurred in this case with appellant's property were shares, percentage of shares. And the fact that there was, 48% shares transferred, and then in another set of conveyances, another 20% conveyed, another 20% of shares conveyed.
It wasn't an additional, though. It wasn't an additional 20%.
Sorry.
It was part of that original conveyance.
We don't know that, Your Honor. We don't know that it was or what the shares were identified. But I don't think that's relevant.
Okay.
Because the second 20% is the emphasis again is on the conveyance. So it was another conveyance. And that's our point, that the statute, the plain language of the statute emphasizes the conveyance.
So am I correct in you're reading that last phrase, like if the ownership interest conveyed is more than 50% of the corporation, you're looking at, when you look at the conveyances, right? As opposed to, you're saying to sort of get to where your opposing side would be, is that it needs to say like, if all of the conveyances affect over a 50% change, or if, if they change the overall ownership more than 50%, I mean, is it like, you would need those sort of added qualifiers because you're looking at the conveyance, look at the conveyances, and do they convey more than 50% of the corporation? Regardless, it's not like you can move around anything under 50% however you wish. You're looking at each conveyance, and it's the cumulative. So you would say in the fence analogy that was, you still only have 100% of the fence and 20% is painted, but you could be uncapped, if you uncap a fence, because 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 20 is more than 50%.
Yes, Your Honor. And to take that even a step further, maybe that you could 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%. I mean, even over 100%
right.
could be conveyed.
So there's a distinction between, at the end of the day, it's not like how the uncapping event is calculated. It doesn't really change how ownership percentages.
Correct, Your Honor.
It doesn't change the reality of ownership percentages.
And to that point, the controlling interest or controlling ownership, because in the 50 to 48 example where they swap 4%, for example, so the minority shareholder becomes a majority, the controlling interest changes, that does not uncap under the statute, even though we would potentially think from, you know, that could appear as a transfer of ownership, but that actually does not. And and again, that kind of speaks to the legislature's choice of different mechanics for uncapping for different types of properties. And I do want to.
Counsel, and I know you're gonna go into the different properties, so I mean, obviously, we're stuck on sort of the word cumulative here, right? So, brother counsel has argued that obviously this is nothing, this isn't about cumulative, right? You know, if you get into the summer associations exception, you know, it talks about a cumulative conveyance of more than 50% of the corporation's stock. I mean, one could certainly read that as, you know, an HOA that's a park, summer association has 5 homes and 3 of the homes sold that year, 3 different homeowners, more than 50%. The park or the summer association is not going to be uncapped because they got to carve out. Or I suppose under your argument, it would be one house sold 3 times and that they'd be protected. So, I mean, it's sort of like, what does cumulative mean?
So, Your Honor, I think cumulative to us means adding them together, but the hypothetical or situation involving the resort summer homes under that separate part of the statute, the corporation property, it is being uncapped to an extent through each of those because the common area is allocated to the individual stockholder lessees. So if one property was sold and then sold again and then sold again, let's say in subsequent years or every 5 years or whatever, a portion of that real property would be uncapped, the part that's assessed to that individual stockholder lessee. I did want to touch.
Well, let me just ask you about the first in, first out rule on taxing capital gain income. It's a IRS rule. It's specific to capital gains. Why should it have any application here?
I agree, Your Honor, and I don't believe that it should have any application. Okay. I think it's not relevant. The way that it became part of this case, I think, was the tax tribunal's response to one of the motions or a motion for reconsideration, where there was that raised by appellant kind of the identity of the shares, or making the argument that they were the same shares that were then redistributed. And I think that was the tax tribunal's response to that, leaning on some guidance, but I agree that it's not relevant.
Do you agree with amici treasury that there would be an administration quagmire if we were to agree with the petitioner's position?
Yes, Your Honor. I would. One of the 3 reasons, other than the plain language and the emphasis or reinforcement of that plain language by the legislature's choice elsewhere, is the practical administration of property tax assessments. And I know Justice Zara mentioned the assessor writing a letter, and I think, no, that wouldn't, obviously that would not be a huge burden to communicate. I think the more communication, the better. But, Your Honors, the townships and other local units are responsible for administering property tax assessments and collecting taxes. And our position is counting the total number of shares being conveyed is the only practical approach in supporting the local assessor's office in an assessment administration. There's practically speaking, you know, the local assessing office, our position is, should not be overly burdened with the task of analyzing complex shareholder transactions, identifying which shares are cumulative and non-redundant or redundant or acquired and redistributed, and so on and so forth.
So can you just clarify for me, just so I can understand? So let's say we have A and B, A owns 52%, B owns 48%. A transfers 4% to B.
Yes, Your Honor.
Now B owns more than 50% interest in the corporation, but that would not be an uncapping event because he only transferred 4%.
That's correct, Your Honor.
And if A transferred 1% to C, 1% to D, 1% to E, 1% to F, those are still only 4% and therefore not uncapping.
Correct, that would be 8.
Got it, okay.
There's fairness in the Constitution and the statutory framework, balancing the equities, providing certainty that taxpayer citizens can count on, balanced with the fact that neighbors can pay vastly different tax amounts on similar properties for periods of time based on length of ownership. But in fairness to all other taxpayers, all citizen taxpayers, all other taxpayers, when properties transfer, they should uncap. Your Honors, based on the practical administration of property tax, the plain language of the statute, and the legislature's choice elsewhere of language reinforcing that, we'd ask the court to deny appellant's application. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. The case will be submitted.